Hoi iedereen, hoe gaat het? And welcome back to the channel. That's right, it's time for the language overview of Dutch. But don't worry if you're a native Dutch speaker who's mad about the way I was pronouncing Dutch words in the Germanic evolution videos. In those videos, I had a lot of languages to talk about, so I couldn't really explore too much into the different dialects within those languages. But since this is the language overview focusing specifically on Dutch, I have the chance to actually explain dialectal differences. By the way, same applies for Portuguese speakers after the Romance sound shifts video. That being said, I will still primarily be speaking the standard Dutch dialect I learned, commonly attributed to the Randstad, which is where most of the Netherlands lives. With all that out of the way, let's go! To start, of course we gotta see where the language came from. Dutch, or Nederlands, is a West Germanic language in the Indo-European language family. It's also a Weser Rhine language within that grouping. After that, we get, interestingly enough, Frankish, the West Germanic language best known for influencing and naming French, despite the fact that it was actually unattested. Frankish was spoken from the 400s AD to the 800s AD, and it subsequently evolved into Old Low, Central, and High Franconian, of which we care about Old Low Franconian because that variety is also called Old Dutch. It was spoken from the 800s to the 1100s in what's now the southern Netherlands and northern Belgium, and the first written sentences in it are from the 900s, although Old Dutch writing is somewhat hard to come by. After that, we get Middle Dutch, spoken until the 1500s. Middle Dutch did have a good assortment of literature, and also during that period, a bunch of changes happened to the language. Following Middle Dutch, of course, we get Modern Dutch. The early days of Modern Dutch are when the language really got standardized, including the first Dutch Bible, known as the Statenvertaling, published in 1637. It also spread into the Caribbean through colonization, as well as to South Africa, but now we call that language Afrikaans. Today, Dutch is the official and majority language in the Netherlands, including all of its overseas territories, Belgium, specifically the northern Flanders region, and Suriname. As for speakers, Dutch has about 25 million native speakers and 5 million L2 speakers, which adds up to about 30 million total speakers. So now I'll get into the language itself, starting with the phonology. The phoneme count is a bit complicated. At the lowest, Dutch has 17 vowels and 17 consonants, totaling 34 phonemes, and the only time I've seen a language where the vowel phonemes tie the consonant phonemes, but there are a lot of complications to both of these. First off, this is the count for standard Netherlands Dutch. In Belgium, they still differentiate between g and g, both of which are now pronounced g in the Netherlands. To compare this, both those sounds are found in a word that's very useful in the Netherlands, gracht, which in Belgium is pronounced gracht. Also, those sounds are the rare consonants in Dutch, the voiceless velar fricative g and its voiced counterpart g in Belgium, and just the voiceless uvular fricative g in the Netherlands. Speaking of voicing on fricatives, this is an important topic, and our first allophone. Historically in Dutch, f and s both became voiced v and z respectively at the beginnings of words before a vowel or sonorant, and between vowels if the preceding vowel was long, which is of course a remnant of the vowel and consonant link tandem we talked about in the Swedish video. Take, for example, the singular plural pair of huis versus huizen. Both these allophones are still active in Belgium. However, in the Randstad, the allophone of f no longer happens. It's always voiceless f nowadays there. And same goes for s always being voiceless among even fewer speakers. Also, the s to z thing isn't perfect regardless, as there are somehow words like sommige which break the rules, so I had to begrudgingly include z in the phoneme count. Y'all have no idea how angry I am about that. More on obstruent allophones in the opposite direction this time. All voiced obstruents get devoiced when they're at the end of a word, like in stot, Bart, and rip. But the allophone that may surprise you is actually the one that's not there. Dutch does not aspirate voiceless plosives at the beginning of a word, and I mention this because Dutch is the only major Germanic language that doesn't do that. I have no idea why. For example, bear, trein, koe. No aspiration on any of them. Outside of all that voicing stuff, and at least all the Dutch I've ever heard, clusters of any alveolar obstruent before y simplify into a post-alveolar consonant. This is especially useful knowledge in diminutive terms, as that suffix is y, like in meisje. Before leaving the obstruents, I should mention that while voiced g isn't a native phoneme in Dutch, it did get loaned in a few times. So now we get to the sonorants. As you may have picked up in a few examples, there's an allophone on r where it's tapped in onset position, but becomes the alveolar approximant r in coda position. Hear the difference between the rood and vlinder, or at least that's the system in the standard Dutch I learned, and most of what I hear. For the record, yes, I've been to the Netherlands. However, there are other ways that r gets pronounced. The original way, and the way still done in Belgium, is to always tap or trill it as r. The other main way I've heard, gaining ground from the southern Netherlands, is to make it a uvular trill r, like in German. There's a similar system on le. In the standard Netherlands pronunciation, le is light le in onset position and becomes dark ul in coda position. Hear the difference between lente and vogel. But in Belgium, le is always light and and for some speakers in the Netherlands, it's always dark. And to finish the consonants, the voiced labiodental approximant v is also subject to a bit of dialectal variation, as it's instead bilabial w in Belgium and the southern Netherlands. So now onto the vowels. First thing to mention is that Dutch has vowel length distinction between short and long, often with a quality difference between the lengths. Interestingly though, there is a semi-allophonic system where tense vowels become long if r is after them. For example, voet has a short vowel, but vloer has a long one. I say semi-allophonic because there are recent loanwords that break this pattern. Other than that, I should mention that the long vowels a and o are perfectly monophthongal in Belgium, while in the Netherlands the mouth closes a bit over the duration of them. Compare boot versus boat. Speaking of diphthongs, Dutch has a fairly large amount of them. Admittedly, I only counted the diphthongs that were monophthongs before the Middle Dutch vowel shifts in the phoneme count earlier, those being ow, a, and the especially weird ow. There are more of them, but those are much more justifiable looking at their component vowels separately, and we'll talk more about them in the writing section. As for other stuff about vowels, Dutch has some vowel reduction, namely to in prefixes and suffixes like in beschermen, alle, grappig, and moeilijk. And to finish the phonology, the stress in Dutch goes on the first syllable after any prefixes in native Germanic words and wherever it originally went in loanwords. So now that we've heard the sounds, let's see how Dutch orthography represents them. Dutch uses its own version of the Latin alphabet with officially 26 letters, but really there are only 23 letters, being these. You'll only find Q, X, and A in loanwords. Of the letters, there are 5 vowels and 18 consonants, which brings up the question about vowels that we often have to ask with Germanic languages. How does Dutch represent 17 or more vowels with just 5 vowel characters? Lots of digraphs and multigraphs, that's how. To run through some of them, we first have the combinations that make sense, like AI being I, AU and AUV being AU, AE is A, and so on. As for the ones that make less sense, there's both OU and OUV for OW, IE for A, UE for OU, AU for EA for E, and OA for U, as the letter U actually makes the U sound. By the way, these last two digraphs are the main places where the length of the vowel depends on the following consonant. Speaking of vowel length, it is represented in the orthography, but the way it gets represented depends on the situation, particularly with long A, and O. In monosyllabic words, long vowels are represented by simply duplicating the vowel character, like in straat, bear, and brood. But in multisyllabic words, long vowels like these are represented with one vowel, but also only one of the consonant after it, like the plural forms of the above words, strate, bere, and brode. Contrast this with short vowels, which are represented in multisyllabic words by duplicating the following consonant. For example, in the singular, there's zak, bet, and fos, which pluralize to zaka, beda, and fossa. However, it should be mentioned that if there's a consonant cluster after the long vowel, it'll still be duplicated in the plural form since you can't really use one consonant in that situation, like zwart and zwaarde. 3 final things for the vowels. First, the rest of the multigraphs are basically combinations of the shorter ones like I, oi, ui, iu, etc. Also, the digraph iye specifically is technically considered one letter, so if it's at the beginning of a word and needs to be capitalized, both the letters will be capitalized, like in IJsland and IJsselmeer. And finally, Dutch rarely uses diacritics, but there are 2 of them you'll see. First is the acute or accent aigu, yeah, they just took it from French. It's used for disambiguation, mostly in the case of ein, one, versus Apparently the acute can also be used for focus stress, but I've never actually seen this. The other diacritic is the diaresis or trema, and it's put over a vowel to indicate that it's pronounced individually and not as a multigraph. For example, in creëren in België. So now onto the consonant characters. First off, there are 2 digraphs, ng for ng and ch for ch, but specifically when ch in Belgium. Otherwise, that sound is just represented by ch. But about ch, I should also clarify that if you put s before it, giving you sch, it's not pronounced sh. That's German. It's pronounced as a cluster, sch in onset position like schap, and just s in coda position like Czechisch. And now the final thing for consonant letters, remember all that stuff about the th and s allophones, or almost allophones because of that damn sommige thing? Dutch actually has different letters for the 2 sounds, historical or modern, with a tandem between f and f and between z and s in the corresponding locations, giving us our first ever example of an allograph. For example, there's the verb geloven, meaning believe, which has a f, and one of its conjugations is geloof with an f. And it has the vowel dynamics too, and just at the end here there's capitalization for sentences and proper nouns, but this includes names of languages. So now we get to the grammar, starting as always with the sentence structure. Dutch's default word order is SVO, or subject verb object. For a basic example sentence, we have de muis verborg een vork onder het gebouw. This means the mouse hid a fork under the building. In order, it's article, subject, verb, article, object, prepositional phrase. SVO. Unfortunately, the simplicity ends there. Various situations cause the verb to move around. First off, there are two times when the verb moves to the beginning of the sentence. One of them is in questions, which are effectively VSO. So our example sentence as a question would be Verwacht de meis een vork onder het gebouw? The other time is if an adverb or adverbial phrase begins the sentence. Yep, Dutch has V2 restriction, the Germanic concept where the verb must be the second constituent or indivisible portion in the sentence. If an adverbial phrase starts the sentence, the subject can't go next because that's the second constituent and it's reserved for the verb. So with an adverb, our sentence would be Gisteren verborg de muis een vork onder het gebouw. Yesterday, the mouse hid a fork under the building. And now we have the situations where the verb instead moves to the end of the sentence. First, anytime there's an auxiliary verb, the auxiliary verb stays in the normal spot while the action verb goes all the way to the end. To show this, I'll make our sentence future tense. De muis zal een vork onder het gebouw verbergen. Here, the auxiliary verb zal is right after the subject while the action verb verbergen, now in the infinitive, goes to the end. But also, if either of the VSO triggers from above are in the sentence, the auxiliary verb will move before the subject. So with an adverb, it would be Morgen zal de muis een vork onder het gebouw verbergen. Tomorrow, the mouse will hide a fork under the building. The other time the verb moves to the end of the sentence is if it's in a subordinate clause. So like, I know that the mouse hid a fork under the building. Ik weet dat de muis een vork onder het gebouw verborg. But here's where it gets really interesting. If a subordinate clause has both an auxiliary and action verb, both verbs go to the end of the sentence, but the auxiliary verb still goes before the main verb. So like, I know that the mouse will hide a fork under the building. Ik weet dat de muis een vork onder het gebouw zal verbergen. So now for the other stuff about Dutch word order. Adjectives go before the noun, as do all numbers. Supplemental nouns go before the main noun and compound onto it, and the language uses prepositions, those that go before the noun phrase. Finally, Dutch is an anti-drop language, so using the subject pronoun is required. So now it's time for the nouns. Dutch nouns are inflected for two numbers, singular and plural, while the gender system is actually a bit complicated to explain. Back in the Swedish language overview, I talked about how in Swedish and Danish, the masculine and feminine genders merge into each other, forming the common gender. Dutch is currently in the final stages of that transition. For all intents and purposes, Dutch today has two grammatical genders, common and neuter, as the morphemes that inflect for gender pretty much never differentiate masculine and feminine. However, some dictionaries will still tell you if a common noun was masculine or feminine. There are two times I've seen when the masculine-feminine distinction still matters. One is that in Belgium and some parts of the southern Netherlands, when you need a pronoun for an inanimate noun, they're divided into three genders. The other time is that in very formal contexts, feminine nouns can still optionally take the genitive or possessive article der, while masculine nouns can't, but this is largely obsolete due to Dutch no longer having cases, and the only reason I even know about this is because I reviewed a paper on it in college. In short, I'll spend the rest of this video considering Dutch to have two genders, common and neuter, because I want to still be right in 100 years or so. Unfortunately, the genders generally can't be determined just by looking at the noun. The predictable patterns I can tell you about are that nouns ending with the suffix ing were historically feminine, making them common now, like getting, aardbeving, and regering, and that all diminutive nouns ending with je are neuter, like meisje from earlier. Yes, the word for girl is neuter, it's weird. Other than that, you just gotta learn them alongside their articles. So now for pluralization, it's not too hard. The vast majority of Dutch nouns, regardless of gender, pluralize with the suffix n. Oh, and by the way, I should point something out about this suffix. For the suffix n specifically, in whatever context it happens, since it has other uses, the n disappears, it's just pronounced or at least in most of the Netherlands that's how it goes. It will reappear if the next word starts with a vowel though, so it's basically a Dutch version of liaison. Now that I've said that, some examples of pluralization are kat te katte, hond te honde, ai te haaien, and jaar te jaren. Oh yeah, and you need to remember any spelling changes that happen with the addition of a suffix as discussed in the orthography section. There are a few irregular nouns though. Some of them have a short vowel in the singular but a long one in the plural like dag te dagen and weg te wegen. Some others pluralize with era like kind te kinderen and ei te eieren. And some others have a vowel change like stad te stede, schip te schepen, and koe te koeien. But there is another regular pattern. Nouns that end with suffixes o, un, ar, or a vowel but a only sometimes, or recent loanwords instead pluralize with s as a suffix. If the vowel is something other than a, typically an apostrophe will be added as well. Examples of this are jonge te jongens, meisje te meisjes, adelaar te adelaars, sleutel te sleutels, reger te regers, and auto te autos. So now to quickly finish the nouns, the Germanic case system is gone. We talked a bit about that earlier, but like English and most North Germanic languages, Dutch has retained an s-clitic that goes on a possessor preceding its main noun, but in Dutch this can only be done with people's names. Otherwise you'll have to use the preposition van, meaning of or from. Now look at the articles. Dutch has both definite and indefinite articles, and both of them are words that precede the noun phrase. The indefinite article is pretty simple, it's just un for all words regardless of gender. Note that it's pronounced with a schwa rather than a long a vowel. If you pronounce it ein, that's the number one we talked about in the orthography. On the other hand, the definite article is split up by gender. For common nouns it's de, and for neuter nouns it's het, while for all plural nouns it's Duh. Yeah, it's the same one from the singular common nouns. Outside of those, there are also proximal and distal demonstratives that work the same way. The proximal ones are dit for neuter singular nouns and deze for everything else, and the distal ones are dat for neuter singular and die for everything else. And that should do it for the articles. Alright, now it's pronoun time. Here's the big chart of them, and we'll see what we notice. First off, like with most languages from Western Europe, the chart is organized into the subject pronouns, the object pronouns, and the possessive pronouns. But other than that, why do both the second person singular and plural have 2 rows each? Because of dialects. Namely, the Netherlands uses jy and jullie, while Belgium uses gij and occasionally in the plural gelo. Both these plural forms, by the way, are formed off the singular pronoun plus lieden, a word for people. Looking now at the row with jy, you'll see that despite all those forms being different words, they all have the same unstressed form, je. In fact, a lot of Dutch pronouns have unstressed forms. One mostly reliable pattern is that if a pronoun ends with a, its unstressed form will have like jy te je, mij te me, gij te ge, and so on. In fact, those are the only unstressed forms that are often written. The rest of the shortenings are normally only ever spoken. So now about formality in the second person, it's pretty easy. You just take the object form of gij, which is u, and use it as a subject or object and for either grammatical number. To make it possessive, just add they, making it u. So enough about the second person, what about the third? First off, some confusing stuff. Zij is the subject form for both she and they. Also in the singular, there's the possessive form zijn, which belongs to hij and het, but not zij. Fun. The third-person pronouns also all share a unique reflexive form for when the subject does the action to itself, zich. Zich is also somehow the reflexive object for formal u. The rest of the pronouns just use their regular object as the reflexive. Another interesting grammatical rule on Dutch pronouns is that het can never go after a preposition. If you need to say in it, for example, you'd have to say therein, and in Dutch that's it in. There's a whole system for those. The last thing about the third person is that for the plural object pronoun, hen and hun are completely interchangeable. There's some prescriptivism involved between them, but realistically you'll mostly use the short form z instead. And finally for the pronouns, the possessives don't inflect for gender or number, but when they're in predicative position, they add an to the end. The one exception to this is ons, r, which does inflect for gender and number in the same way adjectives do, so we'll talk about that later. Now we got the super quick section on Dutch numbers, so here's 1 through 10. Obviously there's the acutes over een, we've covered that, but there isn't much else to talk about with these numbers. They also don't inflect for gender, nor do they affect the pluralization of their nouns. Then for the tens, you add the suffix tig onto the ones number, or some version of that number. The biggest change happens on 8, acht, as 80 is tachtig with a whole te on the beginning. And then here's the part that may be the most interesting. To combine a tens place and a ones place, the ones place goes first. So like 32 in Dutch is 32, literally 2 and 30. Here's some other examples. Also, here's 11 through 19 since they're weird as you'd expect. And finally, here are the ordinal numbers 1st through 10th. Outside of course, first, eerste, they're not too weird. They all just add the suffix de or st to the end. And now we can talk about the adjectives. Dutch adjective inflections are actually pretty simple. You either add a to the end or you don't. Unfortunately, figuring out when to add the suffix is a bit complicated. To start off easy, if the adjective is in predicative position, you don't add the suffix, so like the lion is yellow is de leeuw is geel. Moving on to attributive position, something else that's pretty easy. If the noun is definite, then you do add the suffix. For example, the yellow lion is de gele leeuw and the yellow sand is het gele zand. This difference will become important in a minute. This does largely refer to when there's a definite article, but be aware that noun phrases with possessive pronouns also count as definite and the adjectives will behave accordingly. Therefore, modifying the examples from above, my yellow lion is mijn gele leeuw and your yellow sand is jouw gele zand. But here's where it gets interesting. If the noun is indefinite, so there's either un or no article on it, then the adjective inflects for gender. First off, you always add in the plural, but in the singular, if the noun is common, then you add the and if it's neuter, you don't. So it's the same distribution as de versus het for the articles. For example, in the common, a yellow lion is een gele leeuw, while in the neuter, yellow sand is geel zand. So here are the charts for geel and also dik to see the other spelling change. It should also be mentioned that adjectives ending with the un suffix don't inflect at all. That's mostly irregular passive participles like geschreven, written. However, when adjectives become nouns, like if you're saying the yellow one, all adjectives add the including those ending with un, so that phrase is de gele, and the written one is de geschrevene. As far as making adverbs out of the adjectives, that's not a thing in Dutch. And finally, like all Germanic languages, Dutch adjectives have comparative and superlative forms. The comparative, meaning more, adds the suffix like how luid becomes louder. And the superlative adds the suffix ste, making that word luidste. There are some irregular adjectives in this aspect though. For example, there's goed, which becomes beter and beste, and weinig, which becomes minder and minst. Alright, now we gotta talk about the verbs. Dutch infinitive verbs almost all end in un. Some examples of infinitive verbs are eten, bidden, and zitten. As for the small number of verbs that don't have this infinitive suffix, they all still end with n, and some of those are gaan, staan, slaan, zien, and doen. Because of this, there aren't any verb classes to talk about, so let's get right into the conjugating. Since our only real concern here is all the orthographic stuff, the regular verbs I'll use examples will be wensen, gooien, rennen, geloven, and veranderen. I'll also include gaan for the present tense because I need to, but as you may expect, all the verbs I know of whose infinitives don't end with un are irregular in the past, so now let's see the present. Here's the chart for wensen, and you'll see it's just two numbers, three people, nothing too weird, and notably, none of the second person differences matter for verbs, they're all conjugated the same. As for conjugations that apply to all verbs in the present, Dutch is pretty easy. In the singular, the first person is just the root of the verb wens, while in the second and third person it's just the root with the suffix te, wenst. By the way, the second person drops the te if the verb is before the subject. The one plural form is just the infinitive verb, plain and simple. I started with this verb because its root ends with two different consonants, so it doesn't have any internal spelling changes. Similarly, here's gooien, which has a root ending with a vowel. Pretty much the same story, but then getting to the verbs with internal spelling changes, here's the rennen, and you'll see that in the singular forms there's only one n, since those forms only have one syllable. Contrast this with geloven, where the singular forms have a double o. Also, the fe changed to an f since it's no longer intervocalic. Now here's veranderen, just because I wanted to show a longer verb. And finally, here's gaan. Nothing too strange here, outside of the fact that there's only one a in the first person singular form. But before moving on, I need to point out that certain frequent verbs only add a te in the second person singular form. The third person matches the first person, as is the case with willen. And there are also two very important verbs that are irregular in the present. Here's zijn, meaning be. As you might guess, its forms are all over the place. And here's hebben, meaning have. It's mostly regular, except that the third person singular form is heeft. So now we get to the past tense. Here's wensen. As you can see, the regular past tense is formed with the te suffix, but only when the verb root ends with a voiceless consonant, otherwise the suffix is de. There's pretty much only two conjugations to worry about here, the singular wenste and the plural wenste, which just adds an n to the end. And it may be silent depending on dialect. Y'all definitely saw that coming. So yeah, here's gooien with the same suffixes except that it has a de due to no voiceless consonant being gooide and gooide. Then we got rennen, same story pretty much, but now here's geloven, and you'll notice that the fe changed to an f, but the suffix still has a de. This is because the suffix changes based on the original consonant, which in this case was fe. Compare this with ontploffen, for which the infinitive has two f's thanks to the short vowel before it. Its past tense form is ontplofte with a te. And then here's veranderen, completely normal. Unfortunately, say it with me, as a Germanic language, Dutch has a rather large amount of irregular past tense verbs which become past tense by changing their root vowel. Yep, y'all knew this was coming as well. To start, here's gaan, which becomes ging in the past, ginge in the plural. But there's something else to notice. On irregular past tense verbs, the pronoun gij takes a conjugated form with a te at the end, in this case, gingt. Of course, this doesn't matter in the Netherlands, but in Belgium it's still important. As for some other irregular past tense verbs, I'm glad to mention that there are a couple fairly reliable patterns for the vowel changes in Dutch. For one, if the I diphthong is in the infinitive, it'll change to long a in the past, like with kijken becoming keek, begrepen becoming begreep, and all these other wonderful examples. The other pattern is that ou in the infinitive predictably becomes long o in the past, like with duiken becoming dook, sloten becoming sloot, and all these examples. Oh yeah, point about sloot. Since the root already ends with te, the suffix for gij doesn't get added. Unfortunately, not all Dutch irregulars are that friendly. Going back to the verbs whose infinitive forms don't end with the un suffix, here's all their singular forms. We got staan te stond, slaan te sloeg, zien te zag, and doen te deed. And then here's a bunch of other random irregular verbs. And of course, we can't forget about the super common irregulars from earlier, zijn, which is suppleted in the past, and hebben, which becomes hot. With all that being said, there is another way to express the past in Dutch. That's right, much like many other European languages, Dutch has a perfective construction to say that something has, had, or will have happened before something else. This construction uses the appropriately conjugated form of hebben, have, followed by the passive participle of the action verb, or at least most of the time that's how it is, but if the verb is intransitive, then the auxiliary verb will instead be zijn, be. So anyway, how do you make the passive participle? For regular verbs, it's pretty easy. You take the past tense form of the verb, remove the from the end, and add the prefix ge. So using your example verbs, they become gewenst, gegooid, gerend, geloofd, which already had the prefix anyway, and veranderd. So yeah, about the prefixes, there are two ways a prefix could behave when the verb it's on goes into the passive participle form. Some prefixes, namely these, fully replace the ge, like we just saw with veranderen becoming veranderd. But some others, especially those that can be their own words, instead insert the ge prefix between itself and the verb, like how opgeven as a passive participle is opgegeven. Side note about these prefixes, if they're in any non-verb final construction, the prefix will separate from the verb and go after it, so I give up is ik geef op. So yeah, now for the irregular passive participles. Most of them, like opgegeven, have the un suffix, like all the verbs in the predictable patterns we talked about earlier. The passive participle of begrepen is begrepen, but is a replacing prefix, and the passive participle of sluiten is gesloten. Here's some other examples, and unfortunately, as you can see, the root vowel isn't always the same between the past tense and passive participle. Not to mention, just because a verb is irregular in the past tense doesn't guarantee that it's also irregular as a passive participle, or vice versa. For example, zeggen, meaning say, is irregular in the past, zei, but regular as a passive participle, gezegd. So let's move on, and since we were just talking about the passive participle, now we'll talk about the present participle, or as it should be called, the active participle, same with the past participle. It's very easy, you just take the infinitive form and add de to the end, and then you add to the end if you need to for that situation. It's an adjective. The last conjugation to talk about is the imperative. It's also very easy as there's only one form and it's the root of the verb. This pretty much always matches the first person singular present tense form with the predictable exception that for zijn the imperative form is wees. The rest of the things Dutch verbs can do are done using an auxiliary verb. First off there's zullen, which indicates the future tense when conjugated in the present and the conditional mood when it's in the past. There's also kunnen, and here's some others. Finally for the verbs, the negative particle is niet, but placing it is actually a bit of an ordeal. In a basic sentence with a subject, verb, and maybe a non-object predicate, niet goes directly after the verb, so like I don't see is ik zie niet, and I don't see how it happens is ik zie niet hoe het gebeurde. But if you add an object, it gets trickier. For a definite object or a pronoun, niet moves after that object, so I don't see the cat is ik zie de kat niet, and I don't see you is ik zie niet. With an indefinite object though, you replace niet with geen, like in I don't see a cat, ik zie geen kat. These placements of niet largely hold up in sentences where the verb moves before the subject for whatever reason, but note that niet doesn't follow the verb up there. Where it does follow the verb is to the end of the sentence. In those types of structures, niet goes before the verb. For example, I can't see the cat is ik kan de kat niet zien. I know that you don't sleep is ik weet dat je niet slaapt. And weirdest of all, I know that you can't sleep is ik weet dat je niet kunt slapen, with niet going before both verbs at the end. Now for the miscellaneous section, there's one thing to talk about with Dutch, that being the differences on the that conjunction. I actually already fully addressed this in a previous video about watching out for stuff just like this in languages, so I'll import those sentences. First off, if you're connecting the whole main clause to the subordinate clause, then the word is dat, as in, ik weet dat we de film samen zagen. I know that we saw the movie together, but if only the object of the main clause is being connected to the subordinate clause, the conjunction depends on the gender and number of that object. The word is still dat for singular neuter nouns, as in, ze vergaf het hert dat voor auto sprong. She forgave the deer that jumped in front of her car. The Dutch word for deer, hert, is neuter, but if the noun is common singular, then the conjunction is die. So let's replace the deer with the cow, koe, which is common gender in Dutch, and that sense is, ze vergaf de koe die voor auto sprong. She forgave the cow that jumped in front of her car, and die is also used for all plural nouns. It's the same distinction system as de versus het. For example, ze vergaf de dieren die voor auto sprongen. She forgave the animals that jumped in front of her car. Deer is actually neuter, but it doesn't matter here since it's plural. Alright, now we've gotten to the example sentences we do at the end to tie everything up. First up is, ik geef toe dat je bier te warm was. This means, I admit that your beer was too hot. First off, ik is the first person singular subject pronoun and it has to be there in Dutch. Then, geef toe is the first person singular present tense conjugation of toegeven, a phrasal verb, i.e. one with a separate preposition as a prefix, meaning admit. Toe by itself means towards, by the way. Moving on, there's the conjunction dat, connecting the whole main clause to the subordinate clause. Then we have je bier. Je is the unstressed form of pretty much all the second person pronouns in the Netherlands, but since this one is possessive, the long form is jou with a we. Then there's beer, naturally the noun meaning beer. Also not really relevant here, but it's neuter. After that, te is the adverb meaning too, as in too much. And then there's the adjective warm, which means hot, and is uninflected as it's in predicative position. And finally, there's was, the suppleted past tense singular conjugation of zijn. It's at the end due to being in the subordinate clause. The other example sentence is, onze konijnen hebben het geld niet bemerkt sinds ze de dekking verwijderden. This means, our rabbits haven't noticed the money since they removed the cover. First up, onze konijnen. Onze is the first person plural possessive pronoun, the only one which inflects like an adjective, and in this case it's onze instead of ons since its noun is plural. And konijnen is the plural of konijn, meaning rabbit. You may know this word from a funny story about Napoleon's brother Louis. Anyway, then we have the auxiliary verb hebben, which is technically conjugated but is present tense plural, so it still has its infinitive form. Then, het is the definite article for neuter singular nouns, and it's followed by the neuter noun geld, meaning money. Now we have the action verb bemerkt in passive participle form. If you're wondering what happened to ge, remember that be is a prefix that replaces it, and of course the negative particle niet is before the action verb since it's at the end of the clause. About that, if you thought that bemerkt would go all the way to the end of the sentence, you're not alone. I also used to think that. But yeah, subordinate clauses don't count for that purpose. So now onto the subordinate clause. Since is the conjunction meaning since. It starts with an S and not a Z due to the preposition te historically coming before it and getting absorbed by the first letter. Then there's ze, the short form of zij, but how do we know it means they and not she? Look at the verb verwijderde. This is the past tense conjugation of verwijderen, meaning remove, and importantly, it's plural. That's how we know what the pronoun means. And finally, de is the definite article for common nouns, and dekking is the common noun meaning cover. It's formed off the verb meaning cover, dekken. In the end, Nederlands is een taal die eenvoudig genoeg lijkt, maar als je erin kijkt is het heel ingewikkeld. Ik kan het zien door de tijdsduur van deze video. Vooral met de dialectvarianten op de klanken, de werkwoorden die vroeger of later in de zin zich bewegen, de geschiedenis met de lange en korte klinkers en medeklinkers heeft Nederlands veel meer grammatica te studeren. Dus nee, Nederlands is niet gewoon een dronken Amerikaan die Duits probeert te spreken, nog een dronken Duitser die Engels probeert te spreken. Het is een heel interessante taal met veel klinkers. Nederlandstaligen, ik hoop dat ik genoeg over alle je dialecten heb gezegd, maar ook gewoon dat ik genoeg over je taal heb uitgelegd. Voeg nog iets anders toe dat jullie willen. En voor iedereen, vind het leuk en abonneer om meer over talen te zien. Bedankt voor het kijken.